Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are covering Spring Starter validation, the valid annotation, binding result, and ideas on where to put your validation logic. So as a backend developer, a massive amount of your time is going to be spent on ensuring you don't put crap data in your database. For example, if the user sends poop123 as an email address, you want your code to prevent saving that to the repository. So when data comes in as JSON on a post request, for example, how should you handle it? We're going to cover 3 ways in this video. This is not all the ways you could do it, but the first one is custom validation. And we already covered this in video number 9. Basically, it's a bunch of if statements that check each property manually. Another way is database level validation, so SQL constraints. So in this SQL query, our name is not null, and our description checks to see if the length is greater than or equal to 5. So you can have this validation built directly into your database. The third way, and this is what we're covering in today's video, is entity level validation. You can have annotations on your Java class that specifically tell it what the property can have as a value. In the below example, you have private string name, and we put the not null annotation saying this field cannot be null. On the description field, we have a size annotation, meaning we have a min length of 5. FYI, there is another layer of validation that could be possible in your application, which is on the UI. In this case, the UI would never send you bad data. So in the HTML form, these validation checks would be handled by JavaScript or TypeScript. This does not count for us as a backend developer. Your APIs must protect themselves. You can't rely on the external world to always send you good data. Sometimes UI developers will make mistakes, but also APIs could be shared between multiple front ends like web, iOS, Android, watch. Maybe you have really robust validation on the web app, but the watch app isn't as robust and relies more on the backend. So here's a possible stack. You could have UI validation, you could have entity validation, which is what we're covering today, application validation, that's the if statements we mentioned in video 9, and you can have SQL constraint validation. And the idea here is the Swiss cheese model, where because you have so many layers of validation, it will be really difficult for an error to get all the way through. It kind of has to line up perfectly. So here's our to-do list. We need to add the Spring Boot starter validation to our pom.xml file. We need to add annotations on our entity. We need to add the valid annotation on our controller. We need to add the binding result also on the controller. And then we need to handle the binding result. So if the property is not valid, we need to send a message back to the UI. Okay, let's get started. So first we need to go to our POM file and add this dependency. This is the Spring Boot starter validation, and then do a Maven refresh. Let's create a new package and then a new entity. I named it post, and I'm going to annotate it with @entity and @data. We will use the ID annotation on our private string ID, and then this is where our validation annotations come into play. So @notNull, our message is going to be name cannot be null, and this will be for our private string name. We're then going to use the size constraint with a min of 5 and a message of description too short, must be 5 characters long. And that will annotate our private string description. Okay, let's create a new class for our controller. I will call it post controller and annotate it with @restController. Let's expose a new endpoint @postmapping/new post. Public response entity, save new post, and then it will accept a request body of type post. And this is important. Next is a binding result. The binding result must come directly after the thing you are validating. So in this case, we're validating a post, meaning the second method parameter must be the binding result. We'll just return a 200 status. Now let's add our logic. So if binding result dot has errors, then we will return response entity dot status http status bad request. And in the body, we're going to send the binding result dot get field error dot get default message. This will be the message that we wrote. Of course, below, this is where you would call repository.save. We did miss something. We need to add the @valid annotation, But let's actually see what happens if we don't add this. So delete this for now. I'll also add a print line statement saying we got an error, and we print out the binding result.getAllErrors. Okay, boot up your project and make your way over to Postman. I have a new request, post/new post, with an ID, a name, and a description. To start off, I put the name as null, and as you can see, we got a 200 status, but we were expecting the error message. That's because we didn't add the valid annotation. So let's make our way back to our controller and add it in. Now it will actually check the binding result. This time when I send it, it says name cannot be null, which is the custom message that we wrote. Let's go ahead and add a name. And this time we get a 200 status, which looks good. But let's check the error message on the description. Description too short, must be 5 characters long. So we tripped the other binding result. If we go into our console, we can see we got an error, and we have a lot of information here that we can use depending on your exact use case, but you can see our message, name cannot be null. And that's more or less the gist of how this works, but before you go, I would like to show you one more thing. There are, of course, many other annotations you can use. So not null, not empty, size annotation with a min or a max, email, pattern. If it's a Boolean value, you can assert true or assert false. If it's a date value, you could say future or present, or you could even annotate at credit card number. So for a full list, you can go to Jakarta's Bean validation specification. There'll be a link in the description where you can check it out. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching.